I thought that I would start with mathematical statistics and try to start from the beginning. So for most people, sort of mathematics strikes fear and statistics seems tedious. So why in the world would you want to combine the two? Let's try some linguistics. So mathematics comes from the Greek, of course, mathematika. You can ask, what is mathematics? And that turns out to be a surprisingly difficult question to answer. So there are philosophers who grapple with this every day. Herbert Courant in his book, Richard Courant, in his book with Herbert Robbins, attempted to answer this question by showing you the mathematical experience. It's a bit like asking, what is football? You can try to understand it theoretically, or you can play it and you can understand what it is. Sort of operationally, however, I think the Greeks got it right, because mathematika comes from mathema, which means lesson or a way of learning. So it's a framework for thought. It is a way to reason and argue and learn and understand correctly, avoiding the slippery slopes that are hidden sometimes. Inferences can often seem easy, but there's often monsters lurking in the shadows. And I very much like the quote by Jacques Adamard, who said that mathematics is basically a way to legitimize the conquests of our intuition. So what we keep here is just trying to be very rigorous and careful in having a language for thought. What about statistics? Statistics, most will say, comes from the Latin status, which would mean the state or would mean power. And that is where maybe the more tedious, somehow, interpretation of statistics would arise. In tax collecting, you had a huge empire, you had to collect taxes, you had to keep the books. So, sort of just writing down things and listing things. As a Greek, I would rather go a bit further. Arguably, status itself comes from the Greek verb istame, which means to stand or to have power. And from the same root comes the verb statizo, which means to count, to arrange, and even to conclude. So I much prefer the verb statizo to say that you arrange and you determine. So mathematical statistics, when we put them together, I can find no more eloquent way to describe what it means than this quotation by Ronald Fisher, who said that we may at once admit that any inference from the particular to the general must be attended with some degree of uncertainty. But this is not the same as to admit that such inference cannot be absolutely rigorous. For the nature and degree of the uncertainty may itself be capable of rigorous expression. And this sentence is pregnant with all, I think, that goes into mathematical statistics. It's about inferences from the particular, from the data, to the general, to broad-ranging conclusions, which by nature are cursed by uncertainty. But to admit the existence of this uncertainty is one thing. On the other hand, we can try and understand both where it comes from and to quantify it, therefore making rigorous statements about uncertainty. So what is the particular and the general? Jumping forward to another one of the fathers of mathematical statistics, Jerzy Neyman says that indeterminism in science consists in an effort to invent a hypothetical chance mechanism called the stochastic model, operating on various clearly defined hypothetical entities, such that the resulting frequencies of various possible outcomes correspond approximately to those actually observed. So the particular now becomes the data, it becomes observed frequencies in whatever natural phenomenon we are studying. And then the general is conceptualized by means of a probability model. And this may seem trivially obvious today, but the depth of this kind of framework for thought cannot be overemphasized. Now, it can be said that the notion of a probability model goes back a long way, to go back to Laplace and Gauss, who spoke about the law of errors, but some actually trace it back to Carl Pearson, who saw probability models not just as a means to model error, but to actually model the phenomenon itself. So the roots of statistics, as we modernly understand it, come through biology. In particular, Francis Galton, who was in fact a cousin of Charles Darwin, had understood the importance of biological variation as a key driver in biology, and he had set out to record this biological variation. So he had collected mounds and mounds of data and measurements on all sorts of biological features on all sorts of species. And then Carl Pearson set out to try to somehow statistically describe them in the following sense. Pearson had the realization that what is really important is not the individual measurement, the manifestation, but a distribution lurking behind that describes the population of the objects being measured or of the species being measured. And so together with Galton, they founded the journal Biometrica, which by its name, Biometrica, measuring metrics and biology, was supposed to somehow tabulate all of these different populations. And this is where somehow the typology of science changes, because the new things of science now are no longer the measurements, but the underlying distribution. And this was a revolution in scientific thought, and it's a revolution that has had tangible impact that I will also refer to later. Now, to formalize the notion of a probability distribution, there were of course formulae and expressions, but to get a fully formal theory, we would have to wait a little bit longer than Pearson and Galton. Oh, by the way, Biometrica, even though its origins were in biological measurement, as the name suggests, still exists today as a journal, but today is a journal in theoretical statistics. So in fact, most papers have nothing to do with biology appearing today in Biometrics. Okay, I close this parenthesis. So the general and probability distributions, well, these are a way to quantify uncertainty. And if you think about somehow the state space where the object of interest naturally resides, a probability distribution distributes certainty among all possible outcomes. So something will happen and you're certain of that. And then you can look at subsets of your state space and then assign, relatively how certain are you about this particular outcome as opposed to some other outcome. And you can visualize them, of course, in the simplest case of a one-dimensional phenomenon as somehow positive curves which integrate to one and which tell you for different regions of your domain how likely or unlikely it is to observe a realization in that region. Now, even in one dimension, however, these are very intricate objects possibly. So the universe of possible probability models is very large. And often we need to reduce them into sort of fewer, more tangible, more easily interpretable characteristics, which in fact Carl Pearson called parameters. In the Greek para, which is next, and metron, which is to measure. So next to measurements. It's not really things we measure. They are associated with our measurements. Not sure why this gets stuck. So the most basic parameters that are known to almost anyone are the mean and the variance. In fact, Pearson actually contended that you didn't need to know much more than the mean and the variance. He believed that if you went up to the first 4 moments, so if you included skewness and kurtosis, you could basically generate the entire universe of probability distributions on biological phenomena. And Jerzy Neyman somehow later proved that this was inadequate and you would miss important distributions. It was probably known to Pearson that not all distributions are characterized by their first 4 moments. It was more of a practical consideration. So I'm going to focus not on 4, but on just 2. And somehow we'll argue as this talk evolves that this can often be enough, particularly for very complex phenomena. Which two? Well, the mean can be thought of as the typical outcome. It is what you expect to see as the outcome of your probability experiment. And then you also have the variance, which says, well, of course, in practice, the actual observation will not be this typical value that you expect. So how will the actual outcomes disperse around this typical outcome? And estimating or learning means and variances is a fundamental problem in any science, in particular in statistics. And as I will argue, it can take you a very long way. So they can really be interpreted through expectation. And so this I mentioned about Pearson. What is expectation? It's really just taking averages. Okay, so if your phenomenon was such that you had only a finite list of possible outcomes, and let's say each would have equal probability, then your mean, of course, would be the arithmetic average of these outcomes, so the weighted average by 1 over n. And then the variance would simply be the average square deviation of each possible outcome from this typical outcome that is the mean. But of course, the power of this formalism is that it goes much beyond finite collections of objects. In particular, the fact that we use this expectation symbol is to denote that the averaging may be taking place over a very complex space. It could be over an infinite collection of possible outcomes, or even an uncountably infinite collection of outcomes. And of course, the mean and the variance were already understood in physics before they made their appearance in statistics, as really the mean being the barycenter, the center of gravity. So if you imagine a one-dimensional distribution as a distribution of mass on a thin rod, the mean would be the location you would have to put your finger so that the rod balances. And then the variance would be the moment of inertia. Once you've balanced the rod at its center of mass, if you try to rotate it around that axis, how difficult is it to do this rotation? It becomes increasingly difficult as you have more and more mass distributed far from the mean. As for the entrance of variance as a term in statistical language, though Pearson had spoken of standard deviation, it seems that variance was actually coined also by Fisher in this passage. When there are two independent causes of variability capable of producing in an otherwise uniform population distributions with standard deviation sigma 1 and sigma 2, this is the standard deviation as already known by Pearson, it is found that the distribution, when both causes act together, has a standard deviation of square root sigma 1 squared plus sigma 2 squared. It is therefore desirable in analyzing the causes of variability to deal with the square of the standard deviation as the measure of variability. We shall term this quantity the variance. So it's not a huge step. The standard deviation was already there, but Fisher already recognizes that you should think in terms of variance because that's where the nice decompositions are happening. So it's at the level of squares that we need to think about. And in particular, already as he introduces the term, he introduces the notion of a sum of squares and how this corresponds to analyzing variability. So what can we say more generally? Well, in general, if you have two random objects, X and Y, you can think about them as random real numbers. Then if you ask what is the variance of their sum, the random variable Z, then this will decompose as the sum of the variance of X plus the sum of the variance of Y plus twice the covariance between X and Y. And the covariance, which is related to correlation, also introduced by Francis Galton, is a measure of dependence between the random variables X and Y. Actually, a measure of specifically linear dependence. It can be blind to higher orders of dependence. And formally, it's stated as looking at the deviations of X from its mean, the deviations of Y from its mean, and taking their products and looking at their average. So if X overshoots its mean, typically when Y overshoots its mean, and undershoots its mean when Y undershoots its mean, then you say that these two random variables are positively correlated or have positive covariance. Large values of one tend to go along with large values of the other. And then, of course, you get a negative covariance of small values of one, or undershooting the mean in one case typically is associated with overshooting the mean in the other case. So a high covariance means that you concentrate quite strongly around some kind of one-dimensional line in the XY plane. But if X and Y are independent, in fact, if they are just uncorrelated, if they have no linear dependence, this covariance is going to be zero. And so you will be able, as Fisher said, to write the variance of the sum of the two causes as the sum of the variances of the two causes. And this, even the simple formula, is in some sense a very basic manifestation of an analysis of variance. So Fisher went on to write a series of 3 influential papers. In fact, not in statistics journals. He had some trouble publishing in the Journal of the Royal Statistical Society because, let's just say that he had a tendency to correct some of Pearson's work from time to time, and Pearson didn't appreciate that very much, probably. But in his studies in crop variation, he refers to this phenomenon, the above property of the variance by which each independent cause makes its own contribution to the total enables us to analyze the total and to assign with more or less of accuracy the several portions to their appropriate causes or groups of causes. So you have a more complex phenomenon and you want to analyze where the variation arising in this complex phenomenon can be attributed into simpler causes, okay? And these papers have been hugely influential. The analysis of variance was the first analysis of variance was carried out in studies in crop variation 2. And this is a picture of an actual Latin square design. So Fisher was really trying to understand how to increase the yield of a certain crop based on sort of different conditions. And his contribution was major. So I hinted earlier, the massive contribution to science, but to humanity also. I mean, the population growth, the human population growth of the last 100 years, maybe not a great thing, but the fact that to some extent, at least in the advanced world, hunger has been solved can really be traced back to Rothamsted Experimental Station and Fisher. Fisher in particular understood that in order to understand the attribution of variation, it's not enough to keep some factors constant and only study another factor, but you need to somehow combine them all in variation in a single experiment. But let me close this parenthesis and go back to this sum of squares. So you have a square being equal to the sum of two squares. Where have we seen this before? It goes back a very, very, very long way to what is possibly the best known mathematical result ever obtained, attributed to Pythagoras of Samos, the Pythagorean theorem, very probably not proven by Pythagoras himself. He had a whole school around him. He had a group, as we would say today, and anyone proving something in that group, you would then attribute it to the master. So anyway, this is the theorem. He says that if you take a right triangle and you look at the square of the length of the longest side, the hypotenuse, then this can be analyzed as the sum of squares of the two perpendicular sides. It's an extremely simple statement. There's probably over 400 proofs of it by now. Even the other day in the news, I saw an article about some high school students in the US who claim to have discovered a new proof using trigonometry, which was not thought possible because there might be some cyclicity in this argument. And yet, even though it's so simple, it manifests over and over and over again in more fancy cloaking in more and more advanced parts of mathematics and elsewhere. And this is the only theorem I will prove today. And I will prove it because the proof I'm going to show you makes a point that Fisher will make again a little bit later. The proof I will show you is called a proof by subtraction, and I would like to call it a proof by simple rearrangement of the arithmetic. So what do? We create a square of side length alpha plus beta. And we just partition this square in two different ways. One way is by drawing vertical lines from length alpha all the way up, and then from length beta all the way across. And then you divide into four small squares. And I will, two small squares and then two blue rectangles, and I will also draw a diagonal across these rectangles. The other way I can draw lines is to draw straight lines from length A to here, diagonally across, from length A to this length A, and then from length A here to this length A, thus obtaining a quadrilateral in the center of my original square. Now, because this quadrilateral in each case has its side being the hypotenuse of a right triangle with sides alpha and beta, we know that all the sides are equal actually and have to be equal to gamma. And then we can also conclude that the angles here have to be of 90 degrees. Why? Because we know that the sum of this angle plus this angle plus this angle has to be 180. And this angle is one of the angles in the right triangle. This is the third angle in the right triangle. And what we're missing is the right angle. So this angle here as this, as this, as that has to be a right angle. And now we're done, because all we need to observe is that we get our right triangle 4 times in blue here, and we also get it 4 times in blue here. The overall square surface has to be the same in both cases, and so if we subtract 4 times the right triangle, what do we get? Gamma squared is equal to alpha squared plus beta squared. It is but a simple, a careful, or a convenient rearrangement of the arithmetic. Now you can go further with this and consider the law of cosines, and this was already known to Euclid. You might ask, what happens if the triangle is not a right triangle? What can we say about its longest side? Well, in this case, you can still write the square of the longest side as the sum of the squares of the two shorter sides, but you need a correction. And this correction basically reflects how far the angle opposite the longest side is from being a right angle. You look at the deficit or the excess, and in fact, it takes into account also the length of the two other sides. So let's compare the formula for the sum of the variance of the sum of two random variables to this cosine law. In that case, we have the variance of z is the variance of x plus the variance of y plus twice the covariance. And here we have that the square of the longest side is the sum of the squares of the two other sides plus this correction. Very similar. Could it be a coincidence? It could, but in math, coincidences are rare, and at least we like to think they are rare, and we like to think that when we see something similar, it's because there is some deeper reason for this. So we ask the question, could it be that random quantities can be seen as sides of triangles, that the angles between these sides reflect covariance between random quantities, and that basically the analysis of variance into components, as Fisher suggests, is simply a Pythagorean theorem? And the answer is yes, and yes, and yes. And actually, Fisher already knew about this because in some of his later proofs, you can see arguments of sort of multivariate geometry coming in. Now, Fisher did not know how deep this goes, okay? And in fact, one can show that there exists somewhere, maybe in the world of ideas, a space of all past possible random variables where you can think about angles through covariances, and you can think about more complex phenomena being analyzed into simpler causes by means of Pythagorean theorems. And this is Hilbert space. In fact, there is a well-known result, which is in some sense a slightly more general form of the cosine law. It's called the parallelogram law, and it was proven by Roche and Jordan and von Neumann, which essentially says that if you have something like a cosine law, then there must be a space in which you can interpret your points as I said, sides of triangles and so on, and the angles correspond to some measure of dependence. And this space is known as Hilbert space. Now, this was not yet known to Fisher probably, and it is a very complicated space. You know, if you look at its shadows, they're very familiar, but you can't really visualize the whole thing. It's infinite dimensional, and I would say that even experienced mathematicians will often make a mistake in Hilbert space because they use their usual finite dimensional Euclidean intuition. But what's important here is that there is this general formalism that goes a long way. Even artists have tried to depict Hilbert space. I think those of you who have worked with Hilbert spaces will probably disagree that this has anything to do with how we think about it, but there you go. So can we use the geometry of Hilbert space to find interesting sum of squared decompositions, particularly in cases where the phenomenon we're interested in is rather complex? And so the underlying object is not as simple as just, you know, a real number, a distribution we can visualize. And this is basically what I like to refer to as the analysis of variance. So it's not really anything specific, but indeed it's understanding variation by decomposing total variances into smaller and interpretable building blocks. And more importantly than me thinking about this, Fisher thought about this, the analysis of variance in this way, because what he says, you know, often when we think about the analysis of variance today, we think about testing if means across different groups are the same. But for Fisher, the term is a very ambiguous one. It is not a mathematical theorem, but rather a convenient way of arranging arithmetic, just like the Pythagorean theorem. So I should now talk a little bit about sort of things that I'm interested in and maybe didn't happen so long ago. So let's go back to mathematical statistics, particularly for more complex objects. And the kinds of problems that I like to think about fall under the umbrella of what is known today as functional data analysis. So this would be resolving the chance mechanisms generating random functions. So now the phenomenon that you want to describe gives rise to a function. Each individual measurement is itself a function. And so we have some reasonable questions here. What is a probability model for a random function? How can we decompose variations among random functions in simple terms? And how can we infer at least some aspects of the underlying probability model? What does a random function even mean? So I think it's fairly easy to think about what a random number is. If I give you a finite list, we have a good way of picking a random number. Just put all the elements of the list in a hat, you stir and you pick something out. Maybe even a random number on, let's say, the continuum, the unit interval. Well, you could start flipping coins, and then if you get heads, you could keep the left half interval, tails, the right half interval. You flip again, you go into a subinterval and keep halving until you get some kind of decimal expansion in the limit. What is a random function? So how do I pick a continuous random function, for example? Well, what is a continuous function? Intuitively, a continuous function is a function that you can draw by putting down your pencil and drawing from left to right continuously without ever lifting your hand from the paper. And if you think about how you might try to draw a random function, you could somehow think about the instantaneous decision you are making as your hand is moving. You are implicitly making constantly a decision if you will keep stroking upwards or downwards. So maybe a model to generate a random function would be to randomize our strokes. So set the pencil down at some point and toss a fair coin. If you get heads, let's say that you stroke upwards with length delta at an angle of 45 degrees. If you get tails, you stroke downwards at length delta, but now at minus 45 degrees. Okay, and when you conclude, you will have a random function. So let's do this. I start with a 5 franc coin. It's nice and big and visible. So heads we go up, tails we go down, tails we go down, heads we go up, tails we go down, heads, tails, and tails. So 5 strokes here. There are 5 degrees of freedom, and here is the random function. And there is some randomness. I mean, you can see these breaks, and we know that at the break points, the decision is random, but in between these breakpoints, basically things are totally deterministic and simple. Well, possibly because our strokes were too long. Maybe we should repeat and we should inject more randomness. There are only 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 degrees of freedom here. Maybe we need more degrees of freedom and shorter scales. So let's do 128 strokes, but each of them be length of 1/8. And I'm not going to do this sequentially. 128 is no small number. And now you see a much better image. This function does start to look quite a bit more random, but maybe still you can see the determinism in some chunks. Well, let's keep going. Just like with picking the random number on 0, 1, we can keep going. We can make finer and finer strokes and bring in more and more coins. So here's 2048 strokes, and the length is 1/32. Scaling is not arbitrary. I selected these numbers for a reason. And now this starts to look quite random. But Kai is not convinced, so I'm going to do basically 1,048,577 strokes, all right, with very, very small size each. And I would say that to the human eye, this now looks quite random. In fact, this is one way to construct a function known as Brownian motion. And it's maybe one of the simplest models of random functions, but the properties are quite uncanny, okay? So we make so many upward and downward strokes, we switch between up and down so often that there is no open interval on which this function is monotonic with positive probability. So think about this. Basically what it means is that in any sort of non-zero time interval, you have gone up and down infinitely many times before you almost ever lifted your pencil from the paper. And you can make this statement rigorous through Blumenthal's 0-1 law. This curve is so intricate that it's almost thick. Its dimension is not 1, it's not 2 either. It's somewhere between 1 and 2. So it's a very complicated object. But more importantly, I think we learned something in how we constructed this, and this is one way, certainly not the only way, and certainly not exhaustive, to generate probability models on random functions. What we did effectively is that we took finer and finer increments that we made totally random. Now, increments for a continuous function, or a differentiable function even better, are expressed by a derivative, and we basically set the derivative here be pure unstructured noise, white noise. Now this makes no sense the way I've written it for Brownian motion. Brownian motion is nowhere differentiable, but let's be physicists for a bit and boldly write this down. So you can now immediately start thinking of more general constructions because we have the tools. Increments as relating to basically, infinite degrees of freedom in coin flips. And you can think of more complicated increments. So for example, you might find how to relate the simple increments with the second order increments, increments of increments, and then postulate that these should have a certain relationship to this total randomness, okay? So this is a much more interesting technique because here now you don't just look at the next step and what you're going to do, but you also look at second degree increments here. You put a second derivative. More generally, you could apply some general pseudo differential operator and postulate that the application of the pseudo-differential operator to your random function results in white noise. So different varieties of these random differential equations will give rise to different fluctuation properties of the random object. And this gives you a framework for thinking about probability models for random functions. Some of these differential equations are going to produce rough paths, so possibly nowhere differentiable. But others, particularly if you start bringing in higher order derivatives, might give you smooth paths. So you can go through a whole variety of very, very different types of objects with this approach. Okay, so the question now is, if we like to be in this context of going from the particular to the general, if we get to observe several realizations of a certain random function, can you recover the chance mechanism or the differential equation that generated it? And I have a picture of Fisher thinking very hard here, because contrary to simple one-dimensional random variables, here we have very complex objects. And so the analysis of variance is not just a useful tool, but it's almost a necessary tool to simplify things. How can we decompose this very intricate variation into simple interpretable sources that allow us to do inference? Now, some of you here may be arriving at the moment where you're nodding off because you think, why care? This is just, as we would say in French, parole de mathématicien. That's just a mathematician speaking. This may just be a mathematical curiosity. Or is it? Here is another gentleman who was thoroughly involved with Hilbert spaces, but the reason I bring him up here is very different. So Erwin Schrödinger, in 1943, gave a series of 3 lectures at Trinity College in Dublin, entitled What is Life? And in these lectures, some argued you can find the roots of modern biophysics, because Schrödinger asked the following interesting question. How can we account for the events taking place in space and time within the boundaries of a living organism, much in the same way as outside, using mathematics and physics? And the particular problem that I came across and became interested in is specifically, how can you do this with regards to the mechanical or fluctuation properties of DNA in solution? So we all, of course, know what DNA is. It's sort of a superstar of biological science. Okay, we know of its structure. But what is interesting, and at least I didn't know before, is that it's not only the specific sequence that matters, but in fact, the mechanical properties can matter. For example, in the packing of the DNA in the nucleus or in the regulation of gene transcription, the actual ways in which DNA somehow fluctuates mechanically can be interesting. And DNA minicircles are short strands of DNA, 150 or so base pairs long, that have been cyclized so that their ends have met, and they are in a naturally stressed state in solution. This stress state helps us amplify intrinsic mechanical fluctuations, and this allows us to study their dependence on the sequence. In particular, this is a data set comprised of about 100 minicircles divided into 2 groups. One group, the blue, contains what is called a Tata box. So a Tata box is a short string, I'm not sure, 10 or so base pairs that you can find the promoter region of most eukaryotic genes, and it actually encourages, it promotes the start of the transcription process. And of the 158 base pairs, the cap minicircles on the right are different only in that box, so in about 10 base pairs. And the question that was posed was, can you see differences in the mechanics or the geometrical structure of the minicircles that you could attribute to this difference? So these minicircles otherwise have undergone the same experimental conditions. And what you see here actually are actual electron microscope images, okay? In fact, this is where I can make a Heidelberg connection in my talk. These minicircles were imaged at the lab of Jacques Dubochet at the University of Lausanne. And this here is Jacques Dubochet in 1982 in Heidelberg, where he developed a process called vitrification, which effectively freezes a sample of biological particles in solution so rapidly that the freezing process does not destroy the biophysical structure of the objects. And for this discovery, he was awarded the Nobel Prize in 2017, along with Joachim Frank, who actually came up with the computational means to use this, and with Richard Henderson of Cambridge, kind of put everything together into a pipeline. So this has become known now as cryo-electron microscopy. And here you can see collections of minicircles. Okay, they're imaged at tilt angles, so 45 degrees, and we know which is which in the two images, and you're trying to reconstruct a one-dimensional curve in 3D. You have two projection images. You can do it with two projection images alone. Okay, so this particular case is easier than the general problem of cryo-EM. So let's go back to sort of probability models for random functions. How can we find a workable version of this kind of structure? Well, suppose that we were smart enough to solve the differential equation that should relate the random function to pure noise. And all I've done here is I've subtracted the mean, because of course, if I have a random function, I can just add to it any constant function that I wish, and that will be its mean. So if the random function has mean 0, I just add something and I see the random function is fluctuations around its mean. So if I could solve this differential equation, then of course the result will be written as an integral. Summation is the opposite of subtraction. And it would be an integral of white noise against something known as the green function. And now you might ask, what is this G? And how does it relate to the fluctuation properties of F? Well, it turns out that G is, in some sense, a standard deviation. In particular, if you take the square of G in an appropriate sense, then the square of G ends up being the covariance function or the covariance kernel of your random function. Basically, it says that if you take a random function and evaluate it at a point U, and if you take it and evaluate it at a different location V, then you get two one-dimensional random variables, and these have a covariance. But now this covariance is a function of two arguments, U and V. But now we can play ball, because now we've related this complicated probability model to a covariance and therefore a variance, and we can hope to use an analysis of variance to simplify our analysis. So in particular, you can define something that you can think of as the total variance of F, which is simply the integral of the variance of the random function over all its locations. And then you can think about the total covariance of two random functions, let's say g of x and h of x. And if you do that, and you imagine that your function f arose as the sum of two simpler functions that are still random, g and h, then the total covariance can be decomposed as the sum of the two total variances plus the sum of the total covariance of the two functions. And once we have this cosine law, we know that somewhere there is a Hilbert space where these random functions can be seen as elements and where covariance expresses angles between them. And the much celebrated result that makes this precise is a very special Fourier series decomposition of a random function, which goes back to independently a Finn, Karhunen, and a Frenchman, Loewe, in the late 40s, and has since become known as the Karhunen-Loewe expansion. And the Karhunen-Loewe expansion basically says that if you take the fluctuations of a random function around its mean function, and these fluctuations are very intricate. Remember, they could be so complex as in Brown in motion, for instance. In particular, they can be uncountably infinitely complex fluctuations. But you can decompose them in a series comprised of deterministic basis functions and random coefficients. And maybe this is not surprising in itself, because you could say, well, I can find a Fourier decomposition for a random function. But this is a very specific system that Karhunen and Love came up with. If you choose this basis system to be comprised of eigenfunctions of the covariance operator, and you can do this by something called Mercer's theorem, then the random coefficients, which can be calculated explicitly using integrals, turn out to be uncorrelated, or in the case of a Gaussian process, independent. So look at what you've been able to do. You've been able to take this super complicated random function and decompose it as superpositions of simple deterministic building blocks, each of which just has a random amplitude fluctuation. And in fact, these random amplitude fluctuations are uncorrelated, or in the Gaussian case, independent. They do not have, one does not have an impact on the other. And these are the simple building blocks now. So finally, you can decompose the total variance as the sum of what are called the eigenvalues of this covariance kernel. And in fact, if you order them in decreasing order, truncation of the series at any finite level will give you the best possible finite dimensional approximation of your otherwise infinite dimensional object. So you get optimal dimension reduction. So let's visit Brownian motion again. The way we constructed Brownian motion was kind of dynamic thing, okay, by increments. But you can actually calculate what the covariance function is for Brownian motion, and it's not very difficult. So the opposite of a derivative is an integral. So the g function would just be indicator x less than y. And if you take the square of this indicator, then you end up with a function which is the minimum of x and y. It's just elementary calculus. So we know what the covariance function is. It's the minimum function. And it's one of those cases where you can solve the eigenanalysis problem exactly. And you end up with having sines here with shifted phases as your basis system. And then your random coefficients are Gaussian with mean 0 and certain sort of decreasing variance. These are the eigenvalues. And notice that the variance decreases like an inverse square. And this gives us a very different way to understand Brownian motion, and possibly a way where it's easier to appreciate its key features. What I'm showing you here in black are the first 6 eigenfunctions, okay? They are unique only up to sine, so I've just chosen a sine arbitrarily. So the first eigenfunction here, which corresponds to the largest eigenvalue, captures most of the variation in the phenomenon. And what you can see that the first eigenfunction does is it gives you a large-scale view on the random function Brownian motion. Does it tend to drift up, or does it tend to drift somehow down away from 0? Any one of the pink curves that you see is multiplication of the black curve with a random amplitude of the right variance as described here. So as you can see, as we go on to higher and higher order eigenfunctions, the fluctuations, the random perturbations become smaller and smaller. So you have been able now to decompose the variance from the largest possible large-scale features to the finest possible fine-scale features. In fact, a way now to understand how you can construct Brownian motion is to say, just pick one of these pink curves at random, independently from each of these plots, add them together. And this video shows you what happens if you do this. So what I'm doing here is I'm really just going on and on and on, going further and further down this hierarchy of eigenfunctions. And each time I'm picking one of those randomly generated pink curves, and you can see, I'm going to go back and I'm going to restart it, that the general features are determined from the very beginning. That's the largest possible scale features. And what changes as you keep going are the finer and finer characteristics. Now, at any step of this construction, the process is just a finite trigonometric series. So it's not only infinitely differentiable, it's in fact analytic. It is kind of the smoothest thing you can imagine. But at the limit, and that's part of why things are complicated, when infinity comes into play, it will become something that is nowhere differentiable. And in fact, this was one of the big questions in early functional analysis, somehow, the fact that limiting objects can have such different features than the sequences that build them. So as you can see, we keep going and going and going. The overall pattern doesn't change very much, but you can just see very, very, very fine motions that correspond to the finest characteristic. This can go on for 5 minutes, but I think we can stop here. By the time it stops, I assure you, it looks just like the Brownian motion you saw in the previous picture. So this was introduced in the late 40s, and immediately Ulf Grenander, a student of Harald Kramer, realized that this has a lot of potential in statistics, because this type of analysis of variance can give you a natural coordinate system to apply statistical methods that come from finite dimensional multivariate phenomena. But it didn't really take off because we couldn't do the computations, okay? So in the late 50s, C.R. Rao, in the Kramer-Rao lower bound, or the Rao-Blackwell theorem, realized that you could use this in longitudinal data analysis, but it didn't really take off until some basic asymptotic theory was worked out in the early 70s and 80s. And then finally, John Rice and Bernard Silverman wrote a very influential paper in 1991, estimating mean and covariance when the data are curves. And then there was an explosion in the field that has come to be known as functional data analysis. So I only have 5 minutes. I would like to conclude by closing the loop, unintended, with the DNA loops. This gives us a framework for thought, because we realize now that comparing the fluctuation properties could be thought of as saying, well, each of these random curves from the two groups of DNA have a Carhoonan-Love decomposition of its own, an analysis of variance of its own, and then we would want to compare these analyses of variance. So this is an analysis of variance of an analysis of variance. It's a double analysis of variance, because the analysis of variance of the random object is itself now the target for inference. And so in some sense, to compare the probability models or the differential equations that govern one or the other type of mini-circle, we wish to compare the covariances. So we have two random samples. We can try to estimate the covariances, construct the empirical versions of the expansions, and then compare them. Now, in basically 4 bullets here, I'm summarizing what you could expand over 2 or 3 papers, and I don't want to get technical. It's a subtle problem, because think about it, when you compare these dynamics or these fluctuation properties, when you go into finer and finer fluctuations, you can start to imagine that sampling variation may start to dominate the signal itself. So you end up in something that's known as an inverse problems context, where you have an ill-posed problem that you need to regularize. And part of the beauty of it, which I don't have time to analyze in this talk, is that covariances can themselves be seen as objects in a different Hilbert space of operators rather than of functions. And there you have a further layer of a Pythagorean decomposition and a Carhoonan-Love expansion that you can use in order to regularize this inverse problem. At the end of the day, you end up with comparing these two singular systems and finding a sensible way to stably make an inferential statement in the form of a p-value, which says, are the fluctuation properties between the two samples shared or not? And this was something of a success story, in that we were able to discover that indeed there is a difference. There's a strongly significant difference, and it's one that was originally not anticipated. because the original analysis of this data set had focused on the means, the traditional analysis of variance. And the means in both classes of mini-circles were the same. They were kind of actually not circles, they were ellipses. So the mean structure of these mini-circles was not different. Rather, it was how they fluctuate around the structure. And what I'm showing you here in red and in blue, in each case is the first eigenfunction, second eigenfunction, third and fourth eigenfunction of one type of mini-circle and of the other, as estimated from the data. And in the dashed and dotted lines, you kind of see what you get by multiplying it with a random coefficient of the right estimated variance. Actually, what I've done here is I just sort of multiplied it with an appropriate quantile from a Gaussian distribution corresponding to that variance, so you can see kind of limits of how it might change. So the biggest effect, accounting for 26% of the variation in both cases, is kind of just an opening and closing. But then you see that a next effect down here is a kind of quenching and pulling. And the first four of these principal components account for a total of, say, for example, in this case, 26 plus, so here we have about 50% of the variation, then another 12% plus 11%, okay? And what's interesting is that the form of the eigenfunctions was not statistically significantly different. So the way that these two types of mini-circles fluctuate is very similar. However, what was different was the intensity of the fluctuations. And what you can see here is that especially in the leading modes of variation, the Tata curves, which are expected to be more flexible because of the Tata box, sort of dominate in variance the cap curves. So I have to stop here. The story can go on in many different directions. So you could imagine that the curves evolve themselves. Here I just showed you static images, but you could actually have a time series of random curves as you would have in molecular dynamics. And then you would have somehow even more intricate variation to decompose. You would have to do both the dynamics and the static variation in one go. You might have nonlinear variation. All of this type of variation in some sense is additive, and this is where these sums of squares come from. But functions could also vary compositionally. So you might compose two random functions rather than add them. And this comes with challenges of its own. Specifically, if you're interested in covariances and their Carhoon and Love decompositions, you need to account for the fact, possibly, that covariances are nonlinear objects because they are non-negative definite kernels. And these nonlinear constraints basically tell you that the right ambient geometry might not be that of a Hilbert space, but it might be that of a Hilbert manifold. So a space that is curved and locally looks like a Hilbert space, but not globally. And when you do this, you find surprising connections with some topics that are of very heavy current interest, such as optimal transport. It turns out that a very fruitful way to think about the space of covariances is through the geometry of mass transportation. If you associate covariances with centered Gaussian processes, and you take what is known as the Wasserstein metric on these Gaussian processes, you get a very fruitful setting to compare them. But of course, all of these problems come somehow along with both curses and blessings of dimensionality. So in infinite dimensions, things are very complicated. It all boils down to the fact that the unit ball is not compact in general. And this can lead to strange phenomena and very brittle regularity. So for example, in finite dimensions, if you average a number of strictly positive definite covariances, so invertible covariances, then the result is strictly positive definite, okay? Now, if you try in this sort of optimal transport geometry to do the same, you can find strange things. You can find that the average in this optimal transport geometry of strictly positive definite covariances might be a rank deficient covariance. It might be a non-invertible covariance. But you also have some positive messages. For example, the fact that you have an infinity there, infinitely many sources of variation, sometimes means that you can do perfect discrimination. Okay, sometimes if you define rules for inference or for classification that ultimately depend on summing sources of variation, because you have infinitely many sources, depending on the convergence or divergence of certain series, you could have sort of perfect inferences. And this was already known to Grenander. So I'll stop here. And I'm just going to say, here's to 100 more years of analysis of variance. I chose this particular topic because of the temporal coincidence. So Fisher submitted on the 20th of March, 1923, so just up to a week today, the paper Studies in Crop Variation 2 to the Journal of Agricultural Science, where, and I will not read it all out, for the first time an analysis of variance is carried out. Now, you might say it's on the undistinguished topic of manure, but in fact, manure at the time meant artificial fertilizer. So Fisher had basically 2 degrees of freedom he was interested in. So he was interested in the potato variety and the type of fertilizer that you would use. And he fitted an analysis of variance where you had these 2 main effects and their interaction 100 years ago, almost today.